Chapter 1: The Weight of Slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, stands as one of the most consequential documents in American history, transforming a war initially fought to preserve the Union into a moral crusade for human freedom that would fundamentally alter the character of American society. The document's journey from conception to implementation reflected the complex political, military, and moral pressures that shaped Lincoln's presidency during the nation's greatest crisis, as the president navigated between competing demands for immediate abolition and concerns about constitutional authority, military necessity, and political survival in a deeply divided nation. The institution of slavery had cast a shadow over American politics and society since the nation's founding, creating contradictions between the ideals of freedom and equality proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence and the reality of human bondage that persisted in half the country. By 1860, approximately 4 million enslaved African Americans labored in the southern states, their unpaid work generating enormous wealth that underpinned the region's economy while creating social and political structures that depended on the systematic denial of human rights. The expansion of slavery into new territories had become the defining political issue of the 1850s, contributing to the breakdown of national political parties and the rise of sectional tensions that would ultimately lead to civil war. Lincoln's personal evolution on the slavery question reflected both his moral convictions and his political pragmatism, as he sought to find constitutional means for addressing what he privately considered a moral evil. As a young politician in Illinois, Lincoln had expressed his belief that slavery was wrong, while acknowledging the constitutional protections that existed for the institution in states where it was already established. His famous debates with Stephen Douglas during the 1858 Senate campaign had articulated a position that opposed slavery's expansion while respecting existing constitutional arrangements, a stance that satisfied neither radical abolitionists nor pro-slavery advocates, but appealed to many moderate voters who sought a middle ground. The Republican Party's platform in 1860 reflected this moderate position on slavery, calling for the institution's containment rather than its immediate abolition, while emphasizing economic development and territorial expansion under free labor. Lincoln's election on this platform triggered the secession crisis that would lead to civil war, as Southern leaders interpreted Republican victory as an existential threat to their social and economic system. The irony that Lincoln's relatively moderate position on slavery would precipitate disunion highlighted the fundamental incompatibility between free and slave labor systems that had developed over decades of westward expansion and economic growth. The outbreak of civil war in April 1861 initially focused on the constitutional question of Union versus secession rather than the moral issue of slavery, as Lincoln sought to maintain the loyalty of border states where slavery remained legal while building the broadest possible coalition for preserving the Union. The president's early statements emphasized that the war's purpose was to restore federal authority rather than to interfere with slavery where it existed under state law, a position that frustrated abolitionists while reassuring conservative Republicans and war Democrats who supported the Union but opposed radical changes to existing social arrangements. Military realities began to complicate Lincoln's careful political balancing act, as enslaved people in the Confederacy sought freedom by fleeing to Union lines, creating humanitarian and political challenges that demanded immediate responses. Union commanders faced difficult decisions about the status of these refugees, who were legally considered property under existing law, but whose labor had supported the Confederate war effort. General Benjamin Butler's designation of escaped slaves as contraband of war provided a legal framework for providing protection without explicitly addressing their status as human beings, but it also highlighted the inadequacy of existing policies for addressing slavery's role in the conflict. The pressure for emancipation intensified as the war continued longer and proved more costly than anyone had anticipated, with abolitionists arguing that striking at slavery would weaken the Confederacy while strengthening the Union cause both domestically and internationally. Radical Republicans in Congress pushed for more aggressive action against slavery through legislation like the Confiscation Acts, which authorized the seizure of Confederate property including enslaved people, while military commanders in the field reported that freed slaves provided valuable intelligence and labor support for Union operations. These practical considerations began to align with moral arguments about slavery's incompatibility with American principles. International considerations also influenced Lincoln's thinking about emancipation, as the president recognized that European powers might intervene on behalf of the Confederacy unless the Union could present the conflict as a moral crusade rather than a mere political dispute. Britain and France had abolished slavery in their territories and possessed strong public sentiment against the institution, making intervention to support a slaveholding Confederacy politically difficult if the Union committed itself to emancipation. The diplomatic advantages of an anti-slavery position became increasingly apparent as the war continued, and the possibility of foreign intervention remained a constant concern. Constitutional questions about presidential authority to act against slavery complicated Lincoln's decision-making as he sought to find legal justification for measures that would go beyond existing federal powers during peacetime. The Constitution provided no clear authority for the federal government to interfere with slavery in states where it was established, leading Lincoln to consider war powers that might justify extraordinary measures during the national emergency. The president's legal background made him acutely aware of the constitutional limitations on federal authority, while also providing him with understanding of how wartime exigencies might expand presidential prerogatives. Political calculations within the Republican Party and the broader Union coalition required careful consideration, as Lincoln weighed the potential benefits of emancipation against the risks of alienating conservative supporters who might withdraw their backing if the war's aims expanded beyond preserving the Union. The president needed to maintain support from war Democrats and conservative Republicans while energizing radical Republicans and abolitionists who provided crucial political backing for the war effort. The timing and scope of any emancipation measure would need to balance these competing political pressures while maintaining the broadest possible coalition for victory. Economic factors also influenced discussions of emancipation, as Northern leaders recognized that freed slaves could provide labor and military support for the Union while denying these resources to the Confederacy. The economic value of enslaved labor to the Confederate war effort made its elimination a legitimate military objective, while the potential for freed slaves to serve in Union forces offered significant strategic advantages. These practical considerations provided additional justification for emancipation measures beyond moral arguments about human rights and freedom. The moral dimension of the slavery question weighed heavily on Lincoln's conscience as he struggled with the contradiction between American ideals and the reality of human bondage in a nation founded on principles of equality and freedom. His private writings and conversations revealed a man deeply troubled by slavery's existence, while constrained by political and constitutional realities that limited his options for addressing what he considered a fundamental moral wrong. The president's personal evolution toward emancipation reflected both changing military and political circumstances and his growing conviction that the Union could not endure permanently half slave and half free. Chapter 2: The Political Crucible. The political pressures surrounding emancipation intensified throughout 1861 and early 1862, as Lincoln faced demands from multiple constituencies while attempting to maintain the delicate coalition necessary for prosecuting the war effectively. Radical Republicans in Congress, led by figures like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, pressed for immediate action against slavery as both a moral imperative and a military necessity, arguing that the Union could not win the war without striking at the foundation of Confederate society and economy. Their influence grew as the conflict proved longer and more costly than anticipated, while military setbacks increased pressure for measures that might weaken Confederate resistance. Conservative Republicans and war Democrats worried that expanding the war's aims beyond preserving the Union would drive away supporters who were willing to fight for constitutional government but opposed radical social change. These moderates feared that emancipation would prolong the conflict by increasing Confederate determination to resist, while potentially alienating border state populations whose loyalty remained crucial for Union success. Their concerns reflected broader Northern ambivalence about racial equality and the social consequences of freeing 4 million enslaved people who might compete with white workers for employment. Border state politicians exercised influence far beyond their numbers, as Lincoln recognized that losing Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, or Delaware could prove fatal to the Union cause. These states contained significant pro-Confederate populations while maintaining slavery under state law, creating complex political dynamics that required careful management. Lincoln's famous observation that "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky," reflected his understanding that political and strategic considerations might override moral imperatives when the Union's survival was at stake. The Democratic Party's opposition to emancipation provided Lincoln with another political challenge, as Democrats denounced any expansion of war aims beyond restoring the Union, while arguing that Republican policies threatened constitutional government and white racial supremacy. Democratic newspapers and politicians charged that Lincoln sought to establish a dictatorship while promoting racial equality that would undermine American social order. The president needed to consider how emancipation might affect Democratic support for the war effort, while avoiding measures that could be characterized as unconstitutional power grabs. Military commanders in the field added their voices to the political debate as they reported on the practical implications of Union policy toward enslaved people who sought freedom within Union lines. Some generals, like John C. Fremont in Missouri and David Hunter in South Carolina, issued their own emancipation proclamations that freed slaves in their departments, forcing Lincoln to revoke these orders to maintain political control while avoiding premature commitments to policies he was not yet ready to implement. These incidents highlighted the tension between military commanders seeking to use all available resources against the enemy and political leaders concerned about broader implications. Abolitionist pressure on Lincoln intensified as prominent figures like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison argued that the president's cautious approach betrayed both moral principles and military necessity. Their speeches and writings challenged Lincoln to live up to American ideals, while warning that the Union could not win the war without enlisting African American support through emancipation. The abolitionists' arguments gained credibility as military reverses demonstrated the inadequacy of limited war aims, while the Confederacy's use of enslaved labor provided obvious targets for Union action. International opinion increasingly favored emancipation, as European publics and governments viewed slavery as a barbarous institution incompatible with modern civilization, making intervention on behalf of the Confederacy politically difficult for democratic governments. British textile workers, despite suffering unemployment due to the cotton shortage caused by the Union blockade, supported the Union cause when it became associated with emancipation rather than mere political reunion. French opinion similarly favored the Union when Lincoln presented the conflict as a struggle for human freedom rather than constitutional technicalities. Cabinet discussions revealed the range of opinion within Lincoln's administration as ministers debated the wisdom, timing, and scope of potential emancipation measures. Secretary of State William Seward generally supported gradual approaches that might achieve emancipation without disrupting the war effort, while Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase advocated more immediate action as both morally necessary and politically advantageous for the Republican Party. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton focused on military considerations, while recognizing the potential value of freed slaves as soldiers and laborers. Congressional action on slavery-related issues provided both pressure and cover for presidential initiatives, as legislators passed measures like the Confiscation Acts and the law abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia. These laws established precedents for federal action against slavery, while testing public reaction to more aggressive policies. The Militia Act of 1862, which authorized the president to use persons of African descent in military service, provided legal foundation for recruiting African American soldiers while implicitly acknowledging their freedom. The president's personal struggles with emancipation reflected both his moral convictions and his constitutional concerns, as he sought to find legal justification for measures that would exceed traditional federal authority. Lincoln's careful study of war powers doctrine convinced him that the extraordinary circumstances of civil war might justify extraordinary measures, but he remained concerned about establishing precedents that could threaten constitutional government in peacetime. His decision-making process involved extensive consultation with legal advisors and political allies, while maintaining secrecy about his evolving plans. Public opinion in the North showed complex patterns as different groups responded to various aspects of the emancipation question according to their economic interests, racial attitudes, and political affiliations. Working-class whites often opposed measures that might increase job competition from freed slaves, while middle-class Republicans generally supported emancipation as consistent with party principles and moral progress. Religious groups divided along denominational and regional lines, with some Protestant churches providing strong support for emancipation, while others expressed concern about social disorder and racial mixing. The timing of emancipation became crucial as Lincoln sought to maximize its positive effects while minimizing political costs and military disruption. The president understood that issuing an Emancipation Proclamation during Union military reverses might appear desperate and ineffective, while waiting for a significant victory would demonstrate strength and determination. The challenge was finding the right moment when military, political, and diplomatic factors aligned to support such a momentous decision. Military recruitment considerations influenced emancipation planning as Union forces faced mounting casualties, while Confederate armies maintained their fighting strength through conscription and determination. The potential for recruiting African American soldiers provided obvious military advantages, but it also raised questions about their treatment, pay, and status that could affect political support for such policies. Lincoln needed to consider whether the military benefits of emancipation would outweigh its political costs, while ensuring that freed slaves could contribute effectively to Union victory. Chapter 3: The Preliminary Proclamation. The Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, provided Lincoln with the military victory he had been waiting for to announce his emancipation policy, though the tactical stalemate that characterized the bloodiest single day in American military history hardly represented the decisive triumph that the president had hoped would support such a momentous decision. Nevertheless, Lee's retreat from Maryland demonstrated Union military capability while providing sufficient political cover for Lincoln to present emancipation as a measure of strength rather than desperation. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, issued on September 22, 1862, gave Confederate states 100 days to return to the Union or face the liberation of their enslaved populations. The preliminary proclamation represented a carefully crafted political document that balanced moral imperatives with practical considerations, while maintaining Lincoln's constitutional concerns about federal authority over state institutions. The president grounded his action in war powers doctrine, arguing that the extraordinary circumstances of rebellion justified extraordinary measures to weaken enemy resistance and restore federal authority. This constitutional framework provided legal justification while acknowledging the temporary nature of wartime powers that might not extend to peacetime governance. The document's language reflected Lincoln's legal training and political sensitivity, as he sought to present emancipation as a military necessity rather than a social revolution, emphasizing the restoration of union rather than the liberation of enslaved people as the primary objective. The proclamation's legalistic tone disappointed abolitionists who hoped for more inspiring rhetoric about human freedom and equality, but it served Lincoln's purpose of maintaining constitutional legitimacy while building the broadest possible support for expanded war aims. The president understood that effective policy required political acceptance as well as moral justification. Reaction to the preliminary proclamation varied dramatically across different constituencies, as supporters and opponents interpreted the document according to their own political and social perspectives. Radical Republicans generally praised Lincoln's action while pressing for broader measures that would guarantee permanent freedom and civil rights for African Americans. Conservative Republicans and war Democrats expressed concerns about the expansion of war aims while acknowledging the potential military benefits of striking at Confederate labor resources. The political challenge was maintaining coalition unity while implementing policies that satisfied no constituency completely. Confederate responses to the preliminary proclamation confirmed Lincoln's expectation that Southern leaders would reject any terms for reunion that included emancipation, thereby justifying the final proclamation while demonstrating Confederate unwillingness to negotiate seriously about ending the conflict. Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders denounced Lincoln's action as unconstitutional tyranny, while arguing that it proved Northern determination to destroy Southern society regardless of constitutional protections. This reaction strengthened Lincoln's political position by showing that the Confederacy preferred continued warfare to accepting emancipation. Border state reactions proved more complex and politically dangerous, as leaders in Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware worried about the implications for slavery within their own borders, while fearing that emancipation might strengthen Confederate recruitment and resistance. Some border state politicians threatened to withdraw support for the war effort if Lincoln proceeded with emancipation, creating serious political challenges for maintaining the Union coalition. The president needed to reassure these crucial allies while maintaining his commitment to the emancipation policy. International responses to the preliminary proclamation generally favored the Union cause, as European governments and publics interpreted Lincoln's action as evidence that the conflict had become a moral crusade against slavery rather than a mere political dispute. British and French officials found it increasingly difficult to justify potential intervention on behalf of a slaveholding Confederacy when the Union had committed itself to emancipation. This diplomatic advantage proved crucial in preventing foreign intervention that might have changed the war's outcome. Military implications of the preliminary proclamation included both opportunities and challenges as Union commanders prepared to implement emancipation policies while maintaining combat effectiveness and unit cohesion. The prospect of recruiting African American soldiers offered significant manpower advantages, but it also raised questions about training, equipment, pay, and the reactions of white soldiers who might resist serving alongside freed slaves. Military leaders needed to balance the practical benefits of emancipation against potential disruption of existing military relationships. The 100-day deadline created both urgency and opportunity, as Lincoln hoped that some Confederate states might consider returning to the Union rather than face emancipation, while simultaneously preparing for the final proclamation if Southern leaders maintained their resistance. The timing provided political cover by demonstrating Lincoln's willingness to negotiate, while making clear that continued rebellion would result in more radical measures. This approach satisfied moderate opinion while maintaining pressure on Confederate decision-makers. Democratic opposition to the preliminary proclamation intensified as party leaders denounced Lincoln's action as unconstitutional usurpation of power, while arguing that expanded war aims would prolong the conflict unnecessarily. Democratic newspapers and politicians charged that Republicans sought to establish racial equality and military despotism, while abandoning the Constitution's protections for state rights and individual liberty. The 1862 midterm elections would provide a crucial test of public support for emancipation policies. Abolitionists expressed mixed reactions to the preliminary proclamation, as they welcomed Lincoln's commitment to emancipation, while criticizing the limited scope and conditional nature of the policy. Frederick Douglass and other African American leaders praised the president's action, while pressing for broader measures that would guarantee permanent freedom and citizenship rights. The abolitionist response highlighted ongoing tensions between pragmatic political approaches and idealistic moral imperatives. The preliminary proclamation's impact on enslaved people themselves was immediate and profound, as news of Lincoln's commitment to emancipation spread throughout the South, despite efforts to suppress such information. Enslaved communities interpreted the proclamation as evidence that freedom was approaching, while beginning to prepare for the opportunities and challenges that liberation would bring. This response demonstrated the profound hunger for freedom that existed within enslaved communities, regardless of paternalistic claims about their contentment. Cabinet discussions following the preliminary proclamation focused on implementation details and political strategies for maintaining support while preparing for the final document. Secretary of War Stanton worked on plans for recruiting African American soldiers, while Treasury Secretary Chase considered the economic implications of emancipation for both Union and Confederate territories. These preparations reflected the administration's commitment to making emancipation effective rather than merely symbolic. Legal challenges to emancipation policies began emerging as opponents questioned the constitutional authority for such measures, while supporters sought to strengthen their legal foundations through congressional action and judicial precedent. The Supreme Court's potential role in evaluating emancipation created additional uncertainty, while highlighting the importance of building broad political support for policies that might face legal scrutiny. Lincoln's legal background made him acutely aware of these challenges, while providing confidence in his constitutional arguments. The preliminary proclamation's influence on Union military recruiting became apparent as African American men began preparing to serve in federal forces, while Union commanders developed policies for integrating freed slaves into military service. The practical challenges of training, equipping, and commanding African American soldiers required new approaches, while offering significant strategic advantages if successfully implemented. These developments would prove crucial for both military effectiveness and social transformation during the war's remaining years. Chapter 4: The Final Proclamation. New Year's Day 1863 dawned with profound significance for the United States, as President Lincoln prepared to sign the final Emancipation Proclamation, fulfilling his promise made 100 days earlier, while transforming the Civil War from a conflict over Union and secession into a moral crusade for human freedom that would fundamentally alter American society. The president spent the morning at a White House reception greeting hundreds of visitors according to traditional protocol, while understanding that his afternoon signature would mark one of the most consequential moments in American history. The contrast between formal social obligations and revolutionary policy implementation reflected the complex nature of democratic leadership during national crisis. The final proclamation differed significantly from its preliminary version in scope and language, as Lincoln and his advisors refined the document to maximize its practical effectiveness, while addressing legal and political concerns that had emerged during the intervening months. The final version specifically exempted certain areas under Union control, while clearly identifying the regions where emancipation would take effect, reflecting the president's understanding that the measure's legitimacy depended on its precise application to areas in rebellion against federal authority. This geographic specificity provided constitutional justification, while ensuring maximum impact on Confederate military capabilities. The document's most significant addition was its explicit authorization for freed slaves to serve in Union military forces, transforming potential refugees into active participants in their own liberation while providing the Union with desperately needed manpower. This provision reflected months of planning and preparation by War Department officials who had developed policies for recruiting, training, and commanding African American soldiers. The military dimension of emancipation would prove crucial for both Union victory and the permanent establishment of African American freedom and citizenship. Lincoln's decision to frame the proclamation as a military necessity rather than a moral imperative reflected his continued concern about constitutional authority and political support, while providing practical justification for extraordinary wartime measures. The President's legal language emphasized the restoration of federal authority rather than abstract principles of human rights, though the practical effect of freeing nearly 4 million enslaved people represented the largest liberation in human history. This approach satisfied constitutional requirements while achieving revolutionary results through legal processes. The signing ceremony itself was relatively modest considering the document's historical significance, with only a few cabinet members and staff present, as Lincoln carefully reviewed the final text before affixing his signature. The President reportedly paused before signing, expressing concern that his hand might shake from fatigue after hours of handshaking at the morning reception, since he wanted his signature to appear strong and confident for history. This attention to symbolic details reflected Lincoln's understanding that the proclamation's impact would extend far beyond its immediate practical effects. Immediate reactions to the final proclamation varied dramatically across different regions and constituencies, as Americans attempted to understand the implications of this unprecedented expansion of federal authority and social transformation. Northern abolitionists celebrated the proclamation as vindication of their decades-long struggle against slavery, while pressing for additional measures to guarantee permanent freedom and civil rights. Conservative Republicans and War Democrats expressed concerns about the policy's scope while acknowledging its potential military benefits for Union victory. Confederate responses to the final proclamation were predictably hostile, as Southern leaders denounced Lincoln's action as proof of Northern determination to destroy Southern society, while calling for increased resistance to prevent the implementation of emancipation policies. Jefferson Davis and Confederate military commanders used the proclamation to rally Southern support, while arguing that reunion had become impossible given Northern commitment to abolishing slavery. This reaction validated Lincoln's calculation that the Confederacy would reject any reasonable terms for ending the conflict. International reactions strongly favored the Union cause, as European governments found it virtually impossible to justify intervention on behalf of a slaveholding Confederacy when the United States had committed itself to emancipation. British and French public opinion, already sympathetic to anti-slavery positions, provided strong support for the Union cause while making intervention politically impossible for democratic governments. The diplomatic advantages of emancipation proved as important as its domestic political and military effects. The proclamation's impact on enslaved people throughout the Confederacy was immediate and profound, as news of Lincoln's action spread despite efforts to suppress such information. Enslaved communities interpreted emancipation as divine deliverance, while beginning to act on their freedom through escape to Union lines, resistance to Confederate authority, and preparation for new opportunities that liberation would provide. This response demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of political developments that existed within enslaved communities, despite legal prohibitions on education and communication. Military implementation of emancipation policies required extensive planning and coordination, as Union commanders developed procedures for receiving freed slaves while recruiting those capable of military service. The establishment of contraband camps provided temporary shelter and support, while the War Department organized recruiting efforts that would eventually enlist over 200,000 African American soldiers and sailors. These practical measures transformed the proclamation from a symbolic gesture into an effective military and social policy. The constitutional implications of the Emancipation Proclamation extended far beyond slavery to establish precedents for expanded federal authority during national emergencies, while raising questions about the permanent effects of wartime measures. Lincoln's use of war powers to justify emancipation created new understandings of presidential authority, while highlighting the tension between constitutional limitations and practical necessities during Civil War. These precedents would influence American constitutional development for generations, while providing legal foundations for federal civil rights enforcement. Religious responses to the proclamation reflected the complex relationship between Christianity and slavery, as different denominations interpreted Lincoln's action according to their theological and political perspectives. Many Protestant churches celebrated emancipation as fulfillment of divine justice, while others expressed concern about social disorder and the pace of change. African American churches played crucial roles in celebrating the proclamation, while organizing practical support for newly freed people who needed assistance adapting to freedom. Economic implications of emancipation began emerging immediately as the proclamation disrupted Confederate labor systems while creating new opportunities and challenges for freed people seeking employment and economic independence. Union authorities needed to develop policies for managing the transition from slave labor to free labor while ensuring that emancipation contributed to rather than hindered Union military effectiveness. These economic considerations would prove crucial for determining whether emancipation would lead to meaningful freedom or continued exploitation under different forms. The Democratic Party's response to the final proclamation intensified partisan opposition, as party leaders denounced Lincoln's action as unconstitutional tyranny, while arguing that expanded war aims would prolong the conflict unnecessarily. Democratic newspapers and politicians charged that Republicans sought to establish racial equality and military despotism, while abandoning constitutional protections for individual liberty and state rights. This opposition would provide ongoing political challenges, while highlighting the revolutionary nature of emancipation policies. The proclamation's influence on Union military recruiting became apparent as African American men enlisted in federal forces while demonstrating their commitment to freedom through military service. The sight of armed African American soldiers fighting for Union victory provided powerful symbolic evidence of emancipation's transformative effects while contributing practically to Union military capabilities. These developments would prove crucial for both military success and post-war civil rights, as African American military service established claims to citizenship and political participation. Chapter 5: The Transformation of America. The Emancipation Proclamation's long-term impact extended far beyond its immediate wartime effects to fundamentally transform American society, politics, and constitutional government in ways that continue to influence the United States today. The document established precedents for federal protection of civil rights, while creating expectations for racial equality that would drive subsequent political and social developments throughout the Reconstruction period and beyond. Lincoln's action demonstrated that constitutional democracy could adapt to address fundamental moral contradictions while using legal processes to achieve revolutionary social change. The military effectiveness of emancipation became apparent as over 200,000 African American men served in Union forces, providing crucial manpower that helped ensure Northern victory while demonstrating their commitment to freedom through military sacrifice. These soldiers faced discrimination and unequal treatment within Union ranks while proving their courage and effectiveness in combat, earning recognition that would support claims for civil and political rights after the war. The service of African American troops transformed them from freed slaves into citizen soldiers with legitimate expectations for equal treatment under law. The constitutional revolution initiated by the Emancipation Proclamation continued through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, guaranteed equal protection under law, and prohibited racial discrimination in voting rights. These constitutional changes reflected the war's transformation from a conflict over Union and secession into a struggle for fundamental human rights that required permanent legal protections. The amendments established federal authority to protect individual rights against state interference, while creating new definitions of American citizenship that included African Americans. Economic transformations following emancipation proved complex and often disappointing, as freed people gained legal freedom while facing continued economic exploitation through sharecropping, tenant farming, and other arrangements that limited their opportunities for genuine economic independence. The failure to provide land redistribution or other forms of economic assistance meant that many freed people remained dependent on former masters or other white employers who could exploit their economic vulnerability. These economic limitations would constrain African American progress for generations, while highlighting the difference between legal freedom and substantive equality. Political developments during Reconstruction reflected both the promise and limitations of emancipation, as African Americans gained voting rights and political participation while facing violent resistance from white supremacist groups determined to restore racial hierarchy. The election of African American representatives to Congress and state legislatures demonstrated the political potential of emancipation, while the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations revealed the organized opposition to racial equality. The federal government's eventual abandonment of Reconstruction would allow the restoration of white supremacy through legal and extra-legal means. International implications of American emancipation influenced global discussions of slavery and human rights, as the United States joined Britain and France among nations that had abolished slavery within their territories. The American example demonstrated that even nations founded with slavery could eliminate the institution through political processes, providing inspiration for abolitionists in other countries while enhancing American moral authority in international affairs. The connection between democracy and human rights established by emancipation would influence American foreign policy for generations. The memory and commemoration of the Emancipation Proclamation became important elements in American historical consciousness, as different groups interpreted Lincoln's action according to their own political and social perspectives. African Americans celebrated January 1st as a day of liberation, while developing traditions and institutions that honored the proclamation's significance for their freedom and citizenship. White Americans gradually incorporated emancipation into narratives of national progress, while often minimizing its revolutionary implications for racial equality and social justice. Educational and cultural impacts of emancipation included the establishment of schools and colleges for freed people, while African American communities developed institutions that would preserve and transmit their heritage to future generations. The Freedmen's Bureau and Northern Missionary Societies established thousands of schools throughout the South, creating educational opportunities that had been denied under slavery, while training teachers and leaders who would serve African American communities for decades. These educational developments laid foundations for African American intellectual and cultural achievement, despite continued discrimination and limited resources. Legal precedents established by the Emancipation Proclamation influenced subsequent civil rights developments, as federal courts and lawmakers cited Lincoln's action to justify expanded federal authority to protect individual rights against state interference. The proclamation's grounding in war powers doctrine provided constitutional foundations for later civil rights legislation, while demonstrating that extraordinary circumstances could justify extraordinary federal interventions in state affairs. These precedents would prove crucial during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Religious and moral implications of emancipation continued to influence American Christianity as denominations grappled with slavery's legacy while developing new understandings of Christian social responsibility. The proclamation validated anti-slavery interpretations of Christian teaching while challenging churches to address ongoing racial inequality and discrimination. African American churches played particularly important roles in preserving emancipation's memory while providing leadership for subsequent civil rights struggles. Women's rights movements drew inspiration from emancipation, while arguing that principles of human equality should extend to gender as well as race, creating new coalitions and tensions within reform movements. Some women's rights advocates supported African American civil rights, while others resented the political attention given to racial equality when women remained denied basic political rights. These dynamics influenced both movements while highlighting the complex relationships between different struggles for equality and justice. Immigration and ethnic relations were affected by emancipation, as the inclusion of African Americans in American citizenship influenced discussions about the rights and status of other minority groups. The expansion of citizenship rights to include former slaves established precedents for immigrant incorporation, while creating new tensions between different minority communities competing for economic opportunities and political recognition. These developments would influence American approaches to diversity and inclusion for generations. Regional development patterns reflected emancipation's uneven effects, as the South struggled with the economic and social disruption caused by the transition from slave labor to free labor, while the North benefited from industrial growth stimulated by wartime mobilization and expanded markets. The different regional responses to emancipation contributed to ongoing sectional tensions while influencing patterns of migration, investment, and political development that would shape American geography for decades. The global legacy of the Emancipation Proclamation extends beyond American history to influence international human rights movements and efforts to address contemporary forms of slavery and human trafficking. Lincoln's example demonstrates that even entrenched systems of oppression can be overcome through determined political action, while showing that legal changes must be supported by social and economic transformations to achieve meaningful equality. The proclamation's combination of moral vision and practical politics provides a model for addressing contemporary human rights challenges while honoring the courage of those who fought for freedom and justice. The continuing relevance of the Emancipation Proclamation reflects both its historical significance and the ongoing struggle for racial equality in American society, as the document's promises remain partially unfulfilled despite legal and political progress since 1863. Contemporary discussions of systemic racism, criminal justice reform, and economic inequality often reference emancipation as an unfinished revolution that requires continued commitment to achieve its full promise. The proclamation's legacy challenges Americans to complete the work of creating a society that truly provides equality and justice for all its citizens, regardless of race or background.
Chapter 1: From War to Peace. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, thrust the monumental task of Reconstruction into the hands of Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union but possessed neither Lincoln's political wisdom nor his vision for national healing. The murdered president had begun to articulate his plans for rebuilding the shattered nation during his second inaugural address, calling for malice toward none, charity for all. But his death left fundamental questions about the nature of peace unanswered and created a leadership vacuum at the most critical moment in American history. The immediate aftermath of Confederate surrender presented challenges that dwarfed even the complexities of conducting the war itself. 4 million enslaved people had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union victory, but their legal status remained uncertain and their economic future entirely unclear. The Confederate States lay in ruins, their governments dissolved, their economies destroyed, and their social structures fundamentally altered by the abolition of slavery. Perhaps most importantly, the Constitution provided no clear guidance for how states that had attempted to leave the Union should be readmitted, or what conditions could be imposed upon them. The scale of physical destruction across the South was staggering in its completeness. Sherman's march to the sea had left a 60-mile-wide path of devastation across Georgia, while similar campaigns had destroyed railroads, factories, and agricultural infrastructure throughout the region. Cities like Richmond, Atlanta, and Columbia lay in ashes, their commercial districts reduced to rubble and their populations scattered. The plantation system that had defined Southern society for generations had collapsed, leaving both former slaveholders and freed people uncertain about their roles in the emerging social order. President Johnson's initial approach to Reconstruction reflected his background as a Southern Democrat who had opposed secession but harbored deep-seated racial prejudices that would ultimately undermine his presidency. Johnson's Reconstruction Plan, announced in May 1865, was remarkably lenient toward the defeated Confederacy, requiring only that Southern states ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery and repudiate Confederate war debts. This approach reflected Johnson's belief that Reconstruction was primarily an executive responsibility, and that rapid restoration of the Union was more important than fundamental social transformation. The response of Southern states to Johnson's lenient policies revealed the depth of white resistance to meaningful change in the post-war South. State after state elected former Confederate officials to positions of authority, passed black codes that severely restricted the freedom of former slaves, and demonstrated little genuine commitment to accepting the results of the war. These actions convinced many Republicans in Congress that Johnson's approach was fundamentally flawed, and that more stringent requirements would be necessary to ensure that the war's objectives were actually achieved. The Black Codes enacted by Southern legislatures in 1865 and 1866 represented a systematic attempt to recreate slavery in all but name, demonstrating white determination to maintain racial hierarchy despite military defeat. These laws varied from state to state, but typically restricted the movement of African Americans, required them to sign labor contracts that bound them to specific employers, and created separate legal standards that effectively denied basic civil rights to the former slave population. Mississippi's Black Code, for example, required African Americans to provide written proof of employment and authorized local officials to arrest any black person who could not demonstrate a legal means of support. The economic transformation required by Emancipation posed challenges that neither government officials nor private citizens fully understood or were prepared to address. The sudden transition from slave labor to free labor disrupted agricultural production throughout the South, while the destruction of the banking system and Confederate currency left the region without adequate capital for economic reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress in March 1865, represented the federal government's first attempt to provide systematic assistance to both freed slaves and displaced whites, but the agency's limited resources and uncertain authority made it inadequate to address the magnitude of the crisis. General Oliver Howard, appointed as commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, faced the impossible task of facilitating the transition from slavery to freedom with minimal resources and in the face of massive white hostility. The Bureau's responsibilities included distributing food and clothing to destitute populations, establishing schools for freed people, facilitating labor contracts between former slaves and employers, and resolving disputes over land ownership. However, the agency operated with fewer than 1,000 agents across the entire South, and depended heavily on military personnel who often lacked experience with civilian administration. The question of land ownership emerged as one of the most contentious and ultimately tragic aspects of early Reconstruction. Many freed people had come to believe that emancipation would include the redistribution of plantation lands to those who had worked them, a belief encouraged by wartime proclamations like General Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15, which had temporarily granted land along the South Carolina and Georgia coasts to former slaves. However, President Johnson's decision to pardon former Confederates and restore their property rights dashed these hopes, and forced most freed people into exploitative labor arrangements that perpetuated their economic subordination. The development of the sharecropping system represented a compromise between the labor needs of white landowners and the desire of freed people for economic independence, but it ultimately became a mechanism for maintaining racial and economic oppression. Under sharecropping arrangements, former slaves worked plots of land in exchange for a share of the crop, theoretically providing them with more autonomy than wage labor while giving landowners access to necessary workers. However, the system was perverted by exploitative practices, including debt peonage, fraudulent accounting, and legal restrictions that made it nearly impossible for sharecroppers to achieve genuine economic independence. The political awakening of African Americans during the immediate post-war period represented one of the most remarkable aspects of early Reconstruction, as people who had been denied all political rights under slavery quickly organized to demand full citizenship and participation in democratic government. Black political conventions held throughout the South in 1865 and 1866 articulated sophisticated arguments for civil rights and demonstrated that freedom had unleashed tremendous political energy among the former slave population. These gatherings demanded not only basic civil rights, but also access to education, fair labor practices, and full political participation. The emergence of African American political leadership during this period challenged every assumption about racial capacity that had been used to justify slavery. Men like Francis Cardozo in South Carolina, who had been educated at European universities, and Hiram Revels in Mississippi, who would become the first African American senator, demonstrated intellectual capabilities that contradicted racist stereotypes about black inferiority. Their leadership would prove crucial during the more radical phases of Reconstruction, when African Americans briefly gained access to political power throughout the South. The growing tension between President Johnson and the Republican Congress over Reconstruction policy reflected fundamental disagreements about the nature of the Union victory and the requirements for lasting peace. Congressional Republicans, led by figures like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, argued that the Southern states had committed state suicide by seceding and therefore existed as conquered territories subject to federal authority. This interpretation provided constitutional justification for imposing conditions on Southern readmission and protecting the rights of freed people through federal legislation. Johnson's opposition to congressional Reconstruction policies stemmed from both constitutional principles and racial prejudices that put him increasingly at odds with his own party. The president's vetoes of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau marked the beginning of an irreconcilable break with congressional Republicans and set the stage for a constitutional crisis that would dominate American politics for the remainder of the decade. The stage was set for a fundamental conflict over whether Reconstruction would be a conservative restoration of the pre-war Union or a revolutionary transformation of American society that would finally fulfill the promise of equality embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Chapter 2: Congressional Reconstruction and the Second American Revolution. The dramatic shift from presidential to congressional Reconstruction marked a revolutionary transformation in American governance and society that historians have rightfully termed the Second American Revolution. The Republican victory in the 1866 midterm elections provided a decisive mandate for a more radical approach to rebuilding the South, one that would temporarily place the federal government in direct control of Southern states and attempt to create a biracial democracy in the heart of the former Confederacy. This unprecedented experiment in federally mandated social change would test the limits of American democratic institutions and reveal both the potential and the constraints of using government power to promote racial equality. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 represented the most revolutionary legislation in American history to that point, dividing the South into 5 military districts and requiring states to adopt new constitutions that guaranteed African American suffrage before they could be readmitted to the Union. This legislation effectively nullified President Johnson's lenient Reconstruction policies and placed the entire process under congressional control, with military commanders empowered to protect civil rights and oversee the transition to new state governments. The acts also disenfranchised former Confederate officials, while enfranchising all adult male citizens regardless of race, creating the possibility of Republican governments throughout the South. The implementation of congressional Reconstruction required a massive federal commitment that strained the resources and political will of the victorious Union. Military commanders like General Philip Sheridan in Louisiana and General John Pope in Alabama found themselves governing civilian populations, organizing elections, and mediating disputes between races and classes that had been locked in conflict for generations. These officers, trained for warfare rather than civil administration, often struggled to balance their mandate to protect civil rights with their desire to restore order and stability to their districts. The constitutional conventions mandated by the Reconstruction Acts brought together the most diverse political assemblies in Southern history, including African Americans, white Republicans from both North and South, and a small number of conservative whites who chose to participate in the process. These conventions produced remarkably progressive constitutions that established public school systems, expanded civil rights, and created more democratic political institutions than had ever existed in the South. The South Carolina Convention of 1868, which included a majority of African American delegates, created a constitution that one historian has called the most democratic the state had ever known. The emergence of African American political leadership during congressional Reconstruction represented a stunning reversal of centuries of racial oppression and demonstrated the remarkable political capacity of the former slave population. Men like Oscar Dunn, who became Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, and Francis Cardozo, who served as South Carolina's Secretary of State and later Treasurer, brought impressive qualifications to their positions and governed with a competence that contradicted racist assumptions about black capability. Their success in office proved that the exclusion of African Americans from political participation had been based on prejudice rather than natural incapacity. The coalition that governed the Southern states during radical Reconstruction was far more complex and diverse than the derogatory term radical rule suggests. African Americans, while they formed the backbone of Republican support, never controlled state governments outright and often found themselves in alliance with white Republicans whose commitment to racial equality was limited and conditional. These white Republicans included both carpetbaggers, Northerners who had moved south after the war, and scalawags, Southern whites who joined the Republican Party for various economic and political reasons. The achievements of Reconstruction governments in areas like public education represented genuine progress toward creating a more democratic and inclusive society. The establishment of public school systems throughout the South, often for the first time in these states' histories, provided educational opportunities for both black and white children whose families had previously been excluded from formal schooling. In South Carolina, the percentage of children attending school increased dramatically under Republican rule, while states like Mississippi and Louisiana made similar progress in expanding educational access. However, the financial costs of these progressive programs created political vulnerabilities that conservative opponents skillfully exploited. The expansion of government services required increased taxation and government spending that many white Southerners resented, especially when much of the benefit flowed to African Americans, whom they considered undeserving of equal treatment. Conservative Democrats successfully portrayed Republican fiscal policies as wasteful and corrupt, even though much of the increased spending went toward essential infrastructure and services that had been neglected under pre-war governments. The violence that accompanied congressional Reconstruction revealed the depth of white resistance to racial equality and the limitations of federal power in protecting civil rights. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1866, used terrorism and intimidation to undermine Republican governments and prevent African Americans from exercising their political rights. The Klan's campaigns of violence included assassinations of Republican officials, whippings and murders of African American voters, and systematic efforts to destroy black schools and churches that served as centers of political organization. The federal response to Klan violence demonstrated both the potential and the limits of congressional Reconstruction. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 gave the federal government unprecedented powers to combat domestic terrorism, including the authority to suspend habeas corpus and use military force against the Klan. President Ulysses Grant's administration successfully broke Klan power in South Carolina through vigorous prosecution and military intervention, proving that federal determination could overcome organized resistance to civil rights. However, the political costs of such aggressive action made it difficult to sustain over time. The economic policies pursued by Reconstruction governments reflected the complex challenges of transforming a slave-based economy into a modern capitalist system. Republican leaders promoted railroad construction, industrial development, and improved transportation infrastructure that they believed would modernize the Southern economy and create prosperity for all races. However, these policies often involved costly subsidies and tax incentives that increased government debt, while primarily benefiting wealthy investors rather than the poor constituencies that formed the Republican base. The failure to address the land question represented perhaps the greatest shortcoming of congressional Reconstruction, and would have profound long-term consequences for race relations and economic development in the South. Despite the advocacy of radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens, who proposed confiscating large plantations and redistributing them to freed people, Congress never enacted meaningful land reform. This failure left most African Americans economically dependent on their former masters and unable to achieve the economic independence that might have made their political rights more secure. The legal framework created during congressional Reconstruction, particularly the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, represented permanent changes to American law that would eventually provide the foundation for the modern civil rights movement. The 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under law and the 15th Amendment's prohibition of racial discrimination in voting created constitutional principles that would be invoked by civil rights activists a century later. However, the immediate impact of these amendments was limited by narrow judicial interpretation and inadequate enforcement mechanisms. The international dimension of Reconstruction has often been overlooked, but the attempt to create biracial democracy in the American South occurred during a global age of democratic revolution and emancipation. The success or failure of American Reconstruction was closely watched by observers throughout the world, who were interested in whether democratic institutions could successfully integrate formerly oppressed populations. The ultimate failure of Reconstruction would have implications far beyond American borders, demonstrating the difficulty of using legal and political means to overcome deeply entrenched racial hierarchies. The growing opposition to congressional Reconstruction among Northern whites reflected the limited and conditional nature of white commitment to racial equality. As the immediate moral urgency of the anti-slavery cause faded, and the economic costs of maintaining military occupation became apparent, many Northerners began to question whether the experiment in biracial democracy was worth the continued investment of resources and political capital. This growing Reconstruction fatigue among Northern voters would prove crucial in determining the ultimate fate of the revolutionary experiment in racial democracy. Chapter 3: The Rise and Fall of Black Political Power. The period from 1868 to 1876 witnessed the most dramatic expansion of African American political participation in American history, as nearly 700,000 black men gained the right to vote and began electing representatives to every level of government throughout the South. This unprecedented experiment in biracial democracy saw African Americans serve in state legislatures, occupy positions as lieutenant governors and congressmen, and even hold seats in the United States Senate. The achievements of black political leaders during this brief period would not be matched again until the civil rights era of the 1960s, making this era both a high point of democratic participation and a tragic example of how quickly progress toward racial equality could be reversed. The political mobilization of African Americans during Reconstruction was facilitated by institutions that had emerged from the experience of slavery and emancipation, particularly black churches and mutual aid societies that provided organizational networks for political activity. Ministers like Hiram Revels, who would become Mississippi's first black senator, used their pulpits to educate congregations about political issues and encourage voter registration. These religious leaders possessed the education, speaking skills, and moral authority that made them natural political leaders, while their churches provided meeting spaces and communication networks that were essential for political organization. The Union League, originally a Northern patriotic organization, became the primary vehicle for Republican political organization among African Americans in the South. League chapters, often meeting in secret to avoid white retaliation, educated freed people about their political rights, registered voters, and coordinated campaign activities. The League's emphasis on political education was crucial in helping former slaves understand the complex processes of democratic participation, while its secret rituals and oath-taking ceremonies created bonds of solidarity that helped sustain political commitment in the face of violent opposition. The elections of 1868 marked the high point of African American political participation during Reconstruction, as black voters turned out in massive numbers to support Republican candidates and elect representatives who would advocate for their interests. In South Carolina, African Americans constituted a majority of voters and elected a legislature in which black representatives outnumbered whites. Similar patterns emerged throughout the Deep South, where large black populations translated into significant political power when freed people were allowed to vote without intimidation. The quality of African American political leadership during Reconstruction challenged every stereotype about black intellectual capacity and demonstrated the remarkable talents that slavery had suppressed. Francis Cardozo, who served as South Carolina's Secretary of State and Treasurer, had been educated at the University of Glasgow and the London School of Theology before returning to the United States to work for civil rights. Pinckney Pinchback, who briefly served as Louisiana's governor, combined political skill with business acumen in ways that impressed even his opponents. These men and others like them proved that African Americans could govern effectively when given the opportunity. However, the political coalition that brought African Americans to power was inherently fragile and dependent on continued federal protection that proved impossible to sustain indefinitely. Black political leaders found themselves in an awkward position, needing to maintain the support of white Republicans whose commitment to racial equality was often limited, while also satisfying the expectations of black voters who had suffered centuries of oppression. This balancing act became increasingly difficult as white resistance to black political participation intensified and Northern support for Reconstruction waned. The economic challenges facing Reconstruction governments created additional vulnerabilities that conservative opponents skillfully exploited to undermine black political power. The costs of establishing public school systems, rebuilding war-damaged infrastructure, and expanding government services required increased taxation that many white property owners resented. Conservative Democrats successfully portrayed these expenditures as evidence of black incompetence and corruption, even though much of the spending addressed genuine needs that had been neglected by pre-war governments. The violence directed against African American political leaders represented a systematic campaign to destroy black political power through terrorism and intimidation. The assassination of prominent Republicans like Benjamin Randolph in South Carolina and the murder of dozens of black legislators and local officials throughout the South demonstrated that white supremacists were willing to use any means necessary to regain political control. These attacks were often carefully planned and executed with the goal of decapitating black political leadership and deterring other African Americans from seeking office. The federal response to political violence was inconsistent and ultimately inadequate to protect black political rights. While President Grant's administration successfully used federal troops to combat the Ku Klux Klan in some areas, the political costs of military intervention made it difficult to sustain such efforts over time. The Supreme Court's narrow interpretation of the 14th and 15th Amendments in cases like the Slaughterhouse cases and United States v. Cruikshank further weakened federal authority to protect civil rights and left African Americans increasingly vulnerable to local white control. The economic strategies pursued by African American political leaders revealed both their pragmatic understanding of Southern conditions and the constraints they faced in promoting Black advancement. Rather than pursuing radical redistribution of wealth, most Black politicians supported policies designed to promote economic development that would benefit all Southerners while creating opportunities for African American advancement. This moderate approach reflected their recognition that more aggressive policies would provoke even greater white resistance while potentially alienating white Republican allies. The educational achievements of Reconstruction governments represented perhaps their most lasting contribution to Southern society and demonstrated African American commitment to long-term progress rather than short-term political advantage. The establishment of public universities like South Carolina State and Fisk University created educational opportunities that would benefit generations of African Americans, while the expansion of elementary education provided basic literacy skills that had been denied under slavery. Black political leaders understood that education was essential for long-term racial advancement and consistently prioritized school funding, despite political opposition. The international dimension of Black political participation during Reconstruction attracted attention from observers throughout the world who were interested in whether formerly enslaved people could successfully participate in democratic government. European liberals saw American Reconstruction as a test case for democratic inclusion, while conservative observers used any evidence of political difficulties to argue that racial hierarchy was natural and inevitable. The stakes of this experiment thus extended far beyond American borders and contributed to global debates about race, democracy, and human equality. The gradual erosion of federal support for Black political rights became apparent during Grant's second term, as Northern voters grew weary of the costs and complications of Reconstruction. The Panic of 1873 focused attention on economic issues rather than civil rights, while revelations of corruption in Grant's administration undermined Republican credibility and made it more difficult to justify continued intervention in Southern affairs. This shift in Northern opinion created opportunities for conservative Democrats to challenge Republican governments through both legal and extra-legal means. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election by withdrawing federal troops from the South, marked the effective end of meaningful Black political participation for nearly a century. Without federal protection, African American voters found themselves unable to exercise their constitutional rights, while Black officeholders were systematically driven from power through violence, intimidation, and legal manipulation. The brief experiment in biracial democracy had ended, leaving African Americans to face the long night of Jim Crow segregation with only memories of what might have been. The legacy of Black political leadership during Reconstruction would provide inspiration for future civil rights movements, while demonstrating both the possibilities and the limitations of using political power to promote racial equality. The men who served in Southern legislatures and Congress during the 1870s proved that African Americans could govern effectively when given the opportunity, while their ultimate defeat revealed the depth of white resistance to racial equality and the difficulty of sustaining democratic reforms without broad societal support. Their example would eventually inspire a new generation of civil rights leaders who would complete the unfinished business of Reconstruction nearly a century later. Chapter 4: The Violent Counter-Revolution. The systematic campaign of violence and intimidation that swept across the South during the 1870s represented one of the most successful counter-revolutions in modern history, effectively overturning the democratic gains of Reconstruction through a combination of terrorism, economic coercion, and political manipulation. This violent resistance to racial equality was not the spontaneous uprising of defeated Confederates that it has sometimes been portrayed as, but rather a carefully orchestrated movement that used terror as a political weapon to restore white supremacy and Democratic Party control throughout the former Confederacy. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866, became the most visible symbol of organized resistance to Reconstruction, but it was merely one of numerous paramilitary organizations that emerged to combat Republican rule and African American civil rights. Groups like the White League in Louisiana, the Red Shirts in South Carolina, and the Knights of the White Camellia in Alabama shared similar goals and methods, using masked raids, assassinations, and mass intimidation to undermine black political participation and terrorize Republican supporters, both black and white. The social composition of these terrorist organizations revealed that resistance to racial equality extended far beyond the poor whites, who are often blamed for Reconstruction-era violence. Klan membership included substantial numbers of middle-class professionals, merchants, and landowners who had previously held positions of authority in their communities and resented their displacement by Republican governments that included African American officials. Former Confederate officers like Nathan Bedford Forrest provided military expertise and organizational leadership that made these groups far more effective than they would have been as spontaneous mobs. The methods employed by white supremacist organizations were deliberately calculated to maximize psychological terror while minimizing the risk of federal intervention. Night raids on the homes of Republican officials and prominent African Americans served multiple purposes: eliminating specific leaders, intimidating entire communities, and demonstrating white power to terrorize black families with impunity. The ritualistic aspects of Klan violence, including elaborate costumes and ceremonies, were designed to exploit African American folklore about supernatural beings while asserting white cultural dominance. The economic dimensions of the counter-revolution were as important as its political aspects, as white landowners and merchants used their control over credit, employment, and supplies to coerce African American political behavior. Sharecroppers who voted Republican often found themselves unable to obtain supplies or credit from white merchants, while black landowners faced social ostracism and economic boycotts that threatened their livelihood. This economic warfare was often more effective than physical violence in controlling black political behavior because it offered white supremacists plausible deniability while achieving the same results. The federal response to Reconstruction violence was hampered by constitutional limitations, political considerations, and practical constraints that made effective intervention extremely difficult. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 gave the federal government unprecedented powers to combat domestic terrorism, including the authority to suspend habeas corpus and try civilians in military courts. However, these powers were controversial even among Republicans, and could only be used for limited periods without provoking a constitutional crisis. President Grant's administration achieved some notable successes in combating Klan violence, particularly in South Carolina, where federal prosecutors and military commanders broke the organization's power through vigorous prosecution and military intervention. The conviction of hundreds of Klansmen in federal courts demonstrated that organized terrorism could be defeated when the federal government was willing to commit adequate resources and use its full authority. However, these successes required enormous investments of time, money, and political capital that proved impossible to sustain across the entire South. The limitations of federal power became apparent in states like Mississippi and Louisiana, where white supremacist organizations adapted their tactics to avoid direct confrontation with federal authorities while maintaining pressure on African American voters. The White League's overthrow of the Republican government in New Orleans in 1874 demonstrated that well-organized paramilitary forces could challenge federal authority directly, while the Colfax Massacre of 1873 showed that local authorities would not protect African American citizens when they attempted to exercise their constitutional rights. The role of conservative newspapers and intellectual leaders in legitimizing violence against African Americans has often been overlooked in studies of Reconstruction, but their contribution was crucial in creating an ideological framework that justified terrorism as necessary resistance to black domination. Publications like the Charleston News and Courier, and intellectuals like South Carolina's Wade Hampton, developed sophisticated arguments that portrayed white supremacist violence as patriotic resistance to federal tyranny rather than racial terrorism. The international dimension of Reconstruction violence attracted attention from European observers who were interested in whether the American experiment in biracial democracy would succeed or fail. Conservative European commentators used evidence of Southern violence to argue that racial hierarchy was natural and that attempts to create equality between races would inevitably lead to conflict and chaos. These international observers failed to recognize that the violence was deliberately orchestrated by white supremacists, rather than a spontaneous expression of racial incompatibility. The Supreme Court's interpretation of the Reconstruction Amendments severely weakened federal authority to protect civil rights and emboldened violent resistance to racial equality. The slaughterhouse cases of 1873 limited the scope of the 14th Amendment's protection of civil rights, while United States v. Cruikshank in 1876 effectively nullified federal prosecution of those who violated African American voting rights. These decisions created legal loopholes that white supremacists exploited to escape federal prosecution while continuing their campaigns of violence and intimidation. The Hamburg Massacre of 1876 in South Carolina exemplified the sophistication and political calculation that characterized white supremacist violence during the final phase of Reconstruction. The incident began as a dispute over a public road, but escalated into a carefully planned assault on the local black militia that resulted in the execution of several African American prisoners. The massacre was timed to occur during the 1876 election campaign and was designed to terrorize black voters while demonstrating white determination to regain political control regardless of federal law. The economic depression that began with the Panic of 1873 created conditions that facilitated the violent overthrow of Republican governments by focusing Northern attention on economic issues rather than civil rights. The withdrawal of federal troops from many Southern states for riot duty in Northern cities left Republican governments increasingly vulnerable to white supremacist assault, while economic hardship made Northern voters less willing to support expensive federal interventions in Southern affairs. The Mississippi Plan of 1875 became the model for overthrowing Republican governments throughout the South through a combination of violence, economic coercion, and political manipulation. White supremacist organizations in Mississippi coordinated their activities to maximize pressure on African American voters while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid federal intervention. The success of this strategy in eliminating Republican political power in Mississippi encouraged similar campaigns in other Southern states. The ultimate success of the violent counter-revolution against Reconstruction represented not only a defeat for African American civil rights, but also a fundamental failure of American democratic institutions to protect constitutional rights against organized resistance. The federal government's inability to sustain protection for civil rights revealed the limitations of constitutional amendments and federal legislation when they lacked broad popular support and adequate enforcement mechanisms. The lessons of this failure would influence civil rights strategy for generations, demonstrating that legal rights without political power and social acceptance were insufficient to guarantee racial equality. The long-term consequences of Reconstruction violence extended far beyond the immediate political goals of restoring white supremacy and democratic control. The successful use of terrorism to overthrow democratically elected governments established precedents that would influence American race relations for nearly a century, while the federal government's failure to protect constitutional rights created cynicism about the possibility of achieving racial justice through legal and political means. The violent counter-revolution had succeeded in destroying the Second American Revolution and condemning African Americans to generations of segregation, disenfranchisement, and economic subordination. Chapter 5: The Unfinished Revolution. The formal end of Reconstruction with the Compromise of 1877 marked not the completion of a successful policy, but the abandonment of an unfinished revolution that left the fundamental questions of American democracy unresolved. The withdrawal of federal troops from the South and the acquiescence of the Republican Party in the restoration of white supremacist control represented a tragic betrayal of the promises made to 4 million freed slaves and a profound failure of American democratic institutions to protect constitutional rights. The consequences of this abandonment would shape American race relations for nearly a century and demonstrate the fragility of democratic gains when they lack sustained political support. The Compromise of 1877, negotiated in secret meetings between Republican and Democratic leaders to resolve the disputed presidential election, exchanged Rutherford Hayes's presidency for the end of federal protection for African American civil rights. This corrupt bargain, driven by partisan political considerations rather than principles of justice or constitutional law, sacrificed the rights of millions of African Americans to satisfy the political ambitions of white politicians. The compromise demonstrated how easily democratic commitments could be abandoned when they became politically inconvenient for those in power. The immediate aftermath of the compromise saw the rapid dismantling of the democratic gains achieved during Reconstruction, as Southern states implemented new constitutions and legal codes designed to circumvent the 15th Amendment while maintaining the appearance of constitutional compliance. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses effectively disenfranchised most African American voters without explicitly mentioning race, while elaborate registration procedures and arbitrary enforcement made it nearly impossible for black citizens to exercise their constitutional rights. The economic system that emerged in the post-Reconstruction South institutionalized racial inequality through sharecropping, debt peonage, and convict leasing that trapped African Americans in conditions that closely resembled slavery. The failure of Reconstruction to address the land question left most freed people economically dependent on their former masters, while discriminatory lending practices and fraudulent contracts prevented them from achieving economic independence. The convict leasing system, which allowed private companies to lease prison labor for industrial and agricultural work, created incentives for the mass incarceration of African Americans on trivial charges. The legal framework of Jim Crow segregation that crystallized in the 1890s represented the institutionalization of white supremacy through law and custom that touched every aspect of African American life. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 provided constitutional sanction for racial segregation by establishing the separate but equal doctrine, which legitimized discrimination while ignoring the obvious reality that separate facilities were inherently unequal. This legal endorsement of segregation completed the counter-revolution against Reconstruction and ensured that racial inequality would have the force of law behind it. The violence that had been used to overthrow Republican governments during Reconstruction continued in the form of lynching and other forms of racial terrorism that served to enforce the new racial hierarchy through fear and intimidation. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed an epidemic of lynching that claimed thousands of African American lives while demonstrating white power to kill black people with impunity. These acts of terrorism were often public spectacles attended by large crowds and celebrated in local newspapers, revealing the depth of white commitment to maintaining racial supremacy through violence. The educational opportunities that had been created during Reconstruction were systematically undermined by white supremacist governments that drastically reduced funding for black schools while expanding support for white education. The dual school systems that emerged in the South provided African American children with grossly inadequate educational facilities, outdated textbooks, and undertrained teachers, while white schools received the vast majority of public education funding. This educational apartheid ensured that most African Americans would remain trapped in poverty and dependent on white employers for survival. The intellectual and cultural response to the failure of Reconstruction saw the emergence of competing strategies for African American advancement that would influence civil rights activism for generations. Booker T. Washington's accommodationist approach, outlined in his 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech, advocated accepting segregation while focusing on economic advancement through industrial education and self-help. This strategy appealed to white philanthropists and politicians who were comfortable with racial inequality but opposed to racial violence, while critics like W.E.B. Du Bois argued that civil rights could not be sacrificed for economic gains. The international implications of Reconstruction's failure damaged American credibility in global debates about democracy and human rights, as foreign observers noted the contradiction between American democratic ideals and the reality of racial oppression. The emergence of the United States as a world power in the late 19th century occurred simultaneously with the institutionalization of racial segregation, creating tensions that would persist throughout the 20th century. American claims to promote democracy abroad rang hollow when the nation refused to extend democratic rights to its own African American citizens. The Northern acquiescence in the abandonment of Reconstruction reflected not only political expediency, but also the limited and conditional nature of white commitment to racial equality throughout the nation. The growth of scientific racism and social Darwinism in the late 19th century provided intellectual justification for racial hierarchy that appealed to educated Northern whites who had previously supported civil rights. The Supreme Court's increasingly narrow interpretation of the Reconstruction Amendments reflected this broader retreat from the egalitarian ideals that had briefly flourished during the Civil War era. The economic transformation of the South in the late 19th century occurred within the framework of racial oppression established after Reconstruction, ensuring that industrialization would not lead to improved conditions for African Americans. The growth of textile mills, steel production, and other industries provided new opportunities for white workers while excluding African Americans from most skilled positions and relegating them to the most dangerous and poorly paid jobs. This industrial development, celebrated by promoters of the New South, actually reinforced racial inequality by creating a dual labor market based on race. The women's suffrage movement that gained momentum in the late 19th century revealed the complex intersections of race and gender in American politics, as white suffragists often accepted racial exclusion as the price for their own political advancement. The 15th Amendment's extension of voting rights to African American men, while excluding all women, created tensions within the women's rights movement that reflected broader societal assumptions about racial hierarchy. Many white suffragists were willing to accept a political settlement that granted them the vote, while maintaining the disenfranchisement of African American women and men. The legacy of Reconstruction's failure continued to shape American politics and society well into the 20th century, as the precedents established during the post-Reconstruction period influenced responses to subsequent civil rights movements. The federal government's abandonment of African American civil rights after 1877 created expectations that racial oppression would not be challenged by federal authority, while the successful use of violence and intimidation to overthrow democratically elected governments provided a model for future resistance to racial progress. The redemption of Reconstruction's promise would require a new civil rights movement that emerged in the mid-20th century, led by a generation of African Americans who understood that legal rights without political power were meaningless and that federal intervention was essential to overcome local resistance to racial equality. The lessons learned from Reconstruction's failure influenced civil rights strategy, as leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. recognized the need to create moral crises that would force federal intervention while building broad coalitions that could sustain political pressure for change. The unfinished revolution of Reconstruction represents both America's greatest failure and its unrealized potential, demonstrating how close the nation came to fulfilling its democratic ideals while revealing the depth of resistance to racial equality that continues to influence American society. The brief period when African Americans exercised political power and participated fully in democratic government provided a glimpse of what American democracy could become, while its violent overthrow showed how easily democratic gains could be reversed when they lacked sustained commitment from those in power. The ultimate lesson of Reconstruction is that democracy is never secure, and that each generation must actively defend the principles of equality and justice that define the American experiment, lest they be lost to those who would sacrifice democratic ideals for political advantage or racial privilege. Chapter 1: The Genesis of Total War. In the autumn of 1864, as the American Civil War entered its fourth devastating year, General William Tecumseh Sherman stood at a crossroads that would define both his legacy and the future conduct of warfare. The Union had achieved significant military victories, including Sherman's own capture of Atlanta in September, but the Confederacy remained defiant and capable of prolonged resistance. Traditional military campaigns had proven insufficient to break Southern will, leading Sherman to contemplate a revolutionary approach to warfare that would target not just Confederate armies, but the entire economic and psychological foundation of the rebellion. Sherman's evolution from conventional military commander to architect of total war reflected his growing understanding that the Civil War was not merely a conflict between armies, but a struggle between entire societies. His experiences in Georgia had convinced him that the Confederate war effort depended as much on civilian morale and economic resources as on military strength. The plantations that fed Confederate armies, the railroads that transported supplies, and the civilian population that supported the war effort were all legitimate targets in Sherman's expanded conception of military necessity. The strategic situation facing the Union in late 1864 presented both opportunities and challenges that would shape Sherman's decision to march through Georgia to the sea. General Ulysses Grant's Virginia campaign had locked Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a bloody stalemate around Petersburg, while other Union forces were engaged in similar grinding campaigns throughout the South. Sherman recognized that breaking this strategic deadlock required a fundamentally different approach that would strike at the Confederacy's ability to continue the war rather than simply defeating its armies in battle. The political context surrounding Sherman's march was equally important in shaping his strategic thinking. President Abraham Lincoln faced a difficult re-election campaign against Democratic challenger George McClellan, who advocated a negotiated peace that might preserve slavery and Confederate independence. Sherman understood that dramatic military success was essential to ensuring Lincoln's re-election and preventing a political settlement that would negate 4 years of sacrifice. His march would need to achieve not only military objectives, but also political ones that would demonstrate Union determination and Confederate weakness. Sherman's relationship with Grant provided the crucial support necessary for implementing such an unconventional strategy. The two generals had developed a close working relationship during the Vicksburg campaign and shared a similar understanding of the war's nature and requirements. Grant's confidence in Sherman's judgment and his willingness to defend controversial decisions against political criticism were essential factors in allowing the march to proceed. Without Grant's backing, Sherman's radical departure from conventional military wisdom might never have been authorized. The logistical challenges of marching an army through enemy territory without supply lines represented the most obvious obstacle to Sherman's plan. Traditional military doctrine emphasized the critical importance of maintaining secure lines of communication and supply, making Sherman's proposal to cut loose from his base and live off the land appear recklessly dangerous. However, Sherman's careful study of Georgia's agricultural resources had convinced him that the state's rich farmlands could sustain his army while denying those same resources to Confederate forces. The composition and preparation of Sherman's army reflected his understanding of the unique requirements for the proposed campaign. The force of approximately 62,000 men was carefully selected for mobility, self-sufficiency, and discipline, with excess baggage eliminated and supply trains reduced to essential minimums. Each soldier carried 20 days' rations, while the Army's engineering corps was equipped to repair railroads and bridges as needed. This streamlined force was designed to move quickly through Georgia, while maintaining the capability to overcome any resistance it might encounter. Sherman's communications with his subordinate commanders revealed his clear understanding of the march's psychological objectives and the methods needed to achieve them. His orders emphasized the importance of creating a swath of desolation that would demonstrate Union power while demoralizing Confederate supporters. The destruction was to be systematic and thorough, targeting railroads, factories, warehouses, and other infrastructure that supported the Confederate war effort. However, Sherman also issued strict guidelines regarding the treatment of civilians, attempting to limit violence against persons while maximizing damage to property. The Confederate response to Sherman's proposed march reflected both the limited options available to Southern commanders and their failure to fully comprehend the nature of the threat. General John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee, the primary Confederate force in the region, had been severely weakened by previous campaigns and was in no position to prevent Sherman's advance. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his military advisors believed that Sherman's abandonment of his supply lines made him vulnerable to defeat and capture, failing to recognize that the march represented a new form of warfare that made traditional defensive strategies obsolete. The intelligence network that Sherman developed to support his march demonstrated his meticulous attention to detail and understanding of the campaign's requirements. Union spies and sympathizers throughout Georgia provided crucial information about Confederate troop dispositions, civilian attitudes, and the location of valuable military targets. This intelligence allowed Sherman to plan his route carefully, avoiding areas where Confederate resistance might be strong, while targeting regions where maximum damage could be inflicted with minimum risk. The timing of Sherman's march was carefully calculated to achieve maximum political and military impact. The campaign began just after Lincoln's re-election, eliminating concerns about political interference, while the approach of winter made it urgent to complete the march before weather conditions became prohibitive. Sherman also recognized that beginning the march in November would allow him to arrive at the coast in time for the Christmas season, creating powerful symbolic associations between Union victory and the holiday traditionally associated with peace and goodwill. The international implications of Sherman's march were not lost on Union leadership, who understood that European observers would closely monitor the campaign's conduct and outcome. The success of the march would demonstrate Union strength and Confederate weakness to foreign governments that had considered recognizing Confederate independence, while any excessive violence against civilians might damage Union diplomatic interests. Sherman's challenge was to wage war with sufficient severity to achieve his objectives, while maintaining international legitimacy for the Union cause. The preliminary movements that preceded the main march revealed Sherman's understanding of the importance of deception and misdirection in achieving strategic surprise. His forces initially moved in multiple directions, creating uncertainty about their ultimate objective, while preventing Confederate commanders from concentrating their limited forces effectively. This calculated confusion allowed Sherman to achieve the element of surprise that was essential for the march's success, ensuring that Confederate resistance would be minimal and disorganized. As Sherman's army prepared to cut its communications with the North and disappear into the Georgia countryside, the general understood that he was embarking on one of the most audacious military campaigns in American history. The success or failure of the march would determine not only the outcome of the Civil War, but also the future character of American military doctrine and the acceptable limits of warfare. The stage was set for a campaign that would revolutionize military thinking, while hastening the end of the most destructive conflict in American history. Chapter 2: Breaking the Chains of Supply. On November 16, 1864, Sherman's army severed its last telegraph connection with the North and began its historic march into the heart of Georgia, abandoning the conventional military wisdom that had governed warfare for centuries. The deliberate cutting of communication lines represented more than a tactical decision. It symbolized Sherman's rejection of traditional limitations on military operations and his embrace of a revolutionary approach to warfare that would transform the very nature of the conflict. As his 62,000 men disappeared into the Georgia countryside, Sherman embarked on the most audacious gamble of the Civil War. The organizational structure of Sherman's army reflected his understanding of the unique requirements for the campaign ahead. The force was divided into two wings under the commands of Major General Oliver Howard and Major General Henry Slocum, allowing for greater flexibility of movement while providing redundancy in case one wing encountered serious resistance. This twin-column approach also enabled the Army to cover a broader swath of territory, maximizing the psychological impact of the march while reducing the burden on any single area to supply the advancing forces. The initial movements from Atlanta demonstrated Sherman's mastery of strategic deception and his understanding of the importance of keeping Confederate commanders uncertain about his ultimate objectives. While one wing moved southeast toward Macon, suggesting an attack on that important Confederate supply center, the other advanced eastward toward Augusta, creating confusion about Sherman's true intentions. This calculated ambiguity prevented Confederate forces from concentrating against either column and ensured that resistance would remain scattered and ineffective. The destruction of Atlanta's military infrastructure before beginning the march established the pattern of systematic devastation that would characterize the entire campaign. Sherman's engineers demolished railroad facilities, factories, warehouses, and other installations that could support Confederate military operations, creating a zone of destruction that extended for miles around the city. The fires that consumed much of Atlanta's commercial district provided a dramatic demonstration of Union power while eliminating resources that might have supported continued Confederate resistance. The foraging system that sustained Sherman's army during the march represented a radical departure from conventional military logistics that demonstrated both the abundance of Georgia's agricultural resources and the effectiveness of systematic requisitioning. Each regiment detailed experienced soldiers to serve as foragers, who ranged far from the main columns to collect food, livestock, and other supplies from the surrounding countryside. These bummers, as they came to be known, became the primary agents of destruction and the most visible symbols of the march's impact on civilian life. The legal and moral framework that Sherman established for the conduct of the march revealed his attempt to balance military necessity with humanitarian concerns, though the practical implementation of these guidelines often fell short of their theoretical intentions. Official orders prohibited violence against civilians and the destruction of private homes, while emphasizing that destruction should focus on military targets and resources that supported the Confederate war effort. However, the practical difficulty of distinguishing between military and civilian property in an agricultural society made these distinctions largely meaningless. The psychological warfare that accompanied the physical destruction was equally important in achieving Sherman's strategic objectives. The Army's advance created panic among civilian populations who had never experienced the direct effects of war, while rumors of approaching Union forces often preceded the actual arrival of Sherman's columns by days or weeks. This psychological impact extended far beyond the actual path of the march, as reports of Union depredations spread throughout the South and undermined confidence in the Confederate government's ability to protect its citizens. The liberation of enslaved people that occurred as Sherman's army advanced through Georgia added a powerful moral dimension to the campaign, while creating both opportunities and challenges for Union commanders. Thousands of enslaved people abandoned plantations to follow Sherman's columns, seeing the approaching army as their pathway to freedom. While Sherman had not designed his campaign as a liberation effort, the presence of so many freedom seekers created a humanitarian crisis that required immediate attention and demonstrated the march's broader significance in destroying the foundations of Southern society. The Confederate response to Sherman's advance revealed both the weakness of Southern military resources and the failure of Confederate leadership to develop effective countermeasures against this new form of warfare. General John Bell Hood's decision to invade Tennessee rather than pursue Sherman represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the strategic situation and allowed Sherman to operate with virtual impunity. The scattered Confederate forces that remained in Georgia were unable to mount any effective resistance to Sherman's advance, limiting their response to harassment and minor skirmishing. The destruction of Georgia's railroad network represented one of the most strategically significant aspects of the march, as these transportation arteries were essential for Confederate military operations throughout the South. Sherman's engineers developed efficient techniques for destroying railroad tracks, heating the rails over fires made from the railroad ties and then twisting the hot metal around trees to prevent their reuse. This systematic destruction of transportation infrastructure crippled Confederate logistics and made it increasingly difficult to move supplies and reinforcements between different theaters of war. The international attention focused on Sherman's march reflected its significance as a new form of warfare that challenged conventional understanding of military operations and civilian immunity. European military observers closely monitored the campaign's progress, while diplomatic officials debated the implications of Sherman's tactics for international law and the conduct of warfare. The march's success or failure would influence global perceptions of American military capabilities and the Union's prospects for victory in the Civil War. The daily routine of the march revealed the remarkable discipline and efficiency that Sherman's army maintained, despite operating without traditional supply lines. The columns moved with mechanical precision, covering 15 to 20 miles per day while systematically destroying everything of military value in their path. This routine became so established that local civilians could often predict the army's arrival and departure times, creating a surreal atmosphere of predictable destruction. The encounters between Union soldiers and Georgia civilians during the march provided vivid illustrations of the war's human cost and the breakdown of traditional social relationships under the pressure of military occupation. Many soldiers expressed sympathy for the suffering of innocent civilians while simultaneously participating in the destruction of their property and livelihood. These interactions revealed the moral complexity of Sherman's campaign and the difficulty of maintaining humanitarian standards during operations designed to break enemy morale through systematic devastation. The environmental impact of Sherman's march extended far beyond the immediate destruction of property to include lasting damage to Georgia's agricultural and natural resources. The Army's passage left fields trampled, livestock slaughtered or scattered, and farm buildings destroyed, creating long-term economic consequences that would persist well after the war's end. This environmental devastation was an intentional element of Sherman's strategy, designed to prevent the region from contributing to the Confederate war effort for years to come. As Sherman's army advanced deeper into Georgia, cutting a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction through the heart of the Confederacy, the march began to achieve its intended psychological and strategic effects. Confederate morale plummeted as reports of the Army's unstoppable advance spread throughout the South, while Union supporters took heart from this dramatic demonstration of federal power. The march had become more than a military operation. It had evolved into a powerful symbol of the Confederacy's inability to protect its own territory and people from Union forces. Chapter 3: The Harvest of Destruction. By early December 1864, Sherman's army had penetrated deep into the Georgia heartland, leaving behind a trail of systematic destruction that would reshape the economic and social landscape of the region for generations. The march had evolved from a military operation into a comprehensive campaign of economic warfare that targeted every aspect of the Confederate infrastructure, from railroad networks and industrial facilities to plantation houses and slave quarters. The Army's advance had become a relentless machine of destruction that consumed everything in its path, while demonstrating the Union's overwhelming power to strike at the very foundations of Southern society. The pattern of destruction that emerged during the march's middle phase revealed Sherman's sophisticated understanding of the Confederate war economy and his determination to eliminate every resource that might contribute to continued resistance. Railroad facilities received particular attention, with Sherman's engineers perfecting techniques for destroying track and equipment so thoroughly that reconstruction would be impossible with available Confederate resources. Factories, warehouses, and mills were systematically demolished, while cotton stores were burned to prevent their use in financing Confederate operations through European trade. The psychological impact of the march on civilian populations had grown far beyond Sherman's initial expectations, as reports of Union depredations spread panic throughout Georgia and beyond. Refugees fleeing the Army's advance carried tales of destruction that often exceeded the actual damage inflicted, creating a climate of terror that undermined Confederate morale and confidence in their government's ability to provide protection. The mere rumor of Sherman's approach was often sufficient to cause the abandonment of plantations and the flight of white families to areas they believed might be safer. The treatment of enslaved people during the march revealed both the liberating potential of Sherman's campaign and the limitations of Union policy regarding the transition from slavery to freedom. While thousands of enslaved people gained their freedom by following Sherman's columns, the Army was not equipped to provide for their immediate needs or to establish systems for their long-term welfare. Many freedom seekers faced hunger, exposure, and disease, while others were discouraged from following the Army by commanders who viewed them as impediments to military efficiency. The foraging operations that sustained Sherman's army had evolved into a sophisticated system of systematic requisitioning that extended far beyond military necessity to include deliberate economic warfare against the civilian population. The bummers who conducted these operations had developed efficient techniques for locating hidden supplies and valuables, often employing former enslaved people as guides who possessed intimate knowledge of plantation layouts and hiding places. These foraging expeditions became the primary mechanism through which the march's destruction was implemented at the local level. The Confederate attempts to organize resistance to Sherman's advance revealed the fundamental weakness of Southern military resources and the collapse of civilian administration in many areas. Governor Joseph Brown's efforts to mobilize Georgia's militia proved largely ineffective, as most able-bodied men were already serving in Confederate armies elsewhere. The few regular Confederate units available in Georgia were vastly outnumbered and outgunned by Sherman's force, limiting their effectiveness to minor harassment and sabotage efforts that slowed but could not stop the Union advance. The social revolution unleashed by Sherman's march extended far beyond the formal abolition of slavery to include the complete breakdown of traditional racial and class hierarchies throughout the affected regions. Enslaved people who had lived their entire lives under white domination suddenly found themselves in positions to influence the fate of their former masters, while wealthy planters who had never questioned their social superiority faced the humiliation of powerlessness in the face of Union military might. This reversal of social relationships provided a dramatic demonstration of how completely the war had transformed Southern society. The destruction of Georgia's agricultural infrastructure represented one of the most significant long-term consequences of Sherman's march, as the systematic demolition of barns, mills, and processing facilities eliminated the capacity to convert raw agricultural products into finished goods. This destruction was particularly devastating because it targeted not only current production, but also the ability to resume normal agricultural operations after the war's end. The loss of livestock, farm implements, and seed corn would handicap Georgia's agricultural recovery for years to come. The daily experiences of Sherman's soldiers during the march revealed the psychological transformation that occurred as ordinary men participated in unprecedented destruction while operating without traditional military constraints. Many soldiers initially expressed reluctance to engage in systematic destruction of civilian property, but the absence of effective resistance and the abundance of supplies gradually eroded moral inhibitions. The soldiers' letters and diaries from this period document their growing callousness toward civilian suffering, while also revealing continued discomfort with their role as agents of destruction. The international implications of Sherman's march became increasingly significant as reports of the campaign's conduct reached European audiences and influenced diplomatic opinion regarding American affairs. European military experts debated the legitimacy of Sherman's tactics under international law, while governments reassessed their policies toward the American conflict in light of the Union's demonstrated military capabilities. The march's success strengthened arguments against European intervention, while undermining Confederate hopes for foreign recognition and support. The environmental consequences of the march extended beyond immediate destruction to include lasting damage to Georgia's natural resources and agricultural capacity. The Army's passage resulted in the slaughter or scattering of millions of dollars worth of livestock, the destruction of seed stocks essential for future planting, and the elimination of farm buildings and equipment that represented generations of capital accumulation. This environmental devastation was an intentional element of Sherman's strategy, designed to prevent the affected regions from contributing to Confederate war efforts for the foreseeable future. The cultural impact of Sherman's march was perhaps most visible in the destruction of plantation houses and other symbols of Southern aristocratic culture, as Union soldiers systematically demolished the physical manifestations of the slave-based society they were fighting to destroy. These grand houses, with their libraries, artwork, and furniture, represented not only individual wealth, but also the cultural achievements of a civilization built on human bondage. Their destruction symbolized the death of the Old South and the birth of a new social order based on free labor and democratic values. The medical and humanitarian challenges created by the march's impact on civilian populations revealed the campaign's broader human costs and the difficulty of maintaining humanitarian standards during operations designed to break enemy morale through systematic destruction. The displacement of civilian populations, the destruction of food supplies, and the breakdown of social services created conditions that threatened the survival of vulnerable groups including children, elderly people, and pregnant women. While Sherman's orders prohibited direct violence against civilians, the indirect effects of his campaign created suffering that was nearly as severe. The intelligence network that supported Sherman's march had evolved into a sophisticated system that provided detailed information about Confederate troop movements, civilian attitudes, and the location of valuable military targets. This intelligence came from multiple sources including Union sympathizers, escaped enslaved people, and Confederate deserters, creating a comprehensive picture that allowed Sherman to plan his operations with precision while avoiding areas where serious resistance might be encountered. The quality of this intelligence was crucial to the march's success and demonstrated the extent to which Confederate authority had collapsed in many areas. As Sherman's army approached the Georgia coast in mid-December, the march had achieved its strategic objectives of demonstrating Union power, demoralizing Confederate supporters, and destroying the economic infrastructure that sustained the rebellion. The campaign had proven that the Confederacy could not protect its own territory from Union forces, while the systematic destruction had eliminated resources that might have prolonged Confederate resistance. The march to the sea was nearing its climax, and with it, the beginning of the end for the Confederate States of America. Chapter 4: Savannah's Christmas Gift. The approach of Sherman's army to the Georgia coast in December 1864 marked the culmination of one of the most audacious military campaigns in American history, as the general prepared to present the port city of Savannah to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift that would symbolize both Union victory and Confederate collapse. The final phase of the march to the sea required overcoming the last organized Confederate resistance in Georgia, while navigating the complex coastal geography that had long protected Savannah from Union assault. The successful completion of this campaign would demonstrate the Union's ability to strike at will throughout the Confederacy, while establishing a new base for future operations against the heart of the rebellion. The Confederate defenses around Savannah represented the most formidable military challenge that Sherman's army had encountered since leaving Atlanta, as General William Hardee had concentrated the remaining Confederate forces in Georgia behind a system of fortifications that protected the city's landward approaches. These defenses included Fort McAllister, which controlled access to the Ogeechee River and represented the key to establishing communication with the Union fleet, as well as a series of rice field embankments and earthworks that created formidable obstacles to direct assault. The reduction of these positions would require the first serious fighting of the march, and would test Sherman's army's ability to conduct conventional siege operations after weeks of unopposed movement. The strategic importance of Savannah extended far beyond its value as a symbol of Union victory, to include its role as one of the Confederacy's last major ports, and its potential as a base for future military operations. The city's harbor facilities could accommodate large vessels that would allow Sherman to resupply his army and receive reinforcements, while its railroad connections provided access to the interior of South Carolina and the approaches to Charleston. Control of Savannah would also complete the Union's domination of the Georgia coast and eliminate one of the last Confederate outlets for international trade. The assault on Fort McAllister on December 13, 1864, provided Sherman with the dramatic military victory he needed to demonstrate his army's continued combat effectiveness after the long march through Georgia. The fort's fall after a brief but intense bombardment and infantry assault opened the Ogeechee River to Union vessels and established communication with Admiral John Dahlgren's South Atlantic blockading squadron. This connection with the fleet not only provided Sherman with access to supplies and reinforcements, but also announced to the world that his army had successfully completed its march to the sea. The siege of Savannah that followed the fall of Fort McAllister revealed both the strengths and limitations of Confederate defensive strategy in the campaign's final phase. General Hardee's decision to concentrate his forces behind fixed fortifications protected the city from immediate assault, but also trapped his army in a position where it could be surrounded and destroyed. Sherman's methodical approach to reducing the Confederate defenses demonstrated his understanding that the strategic value of capturing Savannah intact outweighed the tactical advantages of a quick assault that might result in the city's destruction. The civilian population of Savannah faced the approach of Sherman's army with a mixture of terror and resignation that reflected their understanding of the devastation that had followed in the wake of the Union advance. Reports of the march's destructive progress had preceded the army's arrival, creating panic among those who possessed the means to flee, while leaving the poor and enslaved population to await their fate. The city's mayor and other civic leaders began preparing for surrender, while attempting to protect as much of the city's infrastructure and civilian population as possible from the destruction that seemed inevitable. The role of enslaved people in facilitating Sherman's approach to Savannah demonstrated the continuing importance of African American support for Union military operations throughout the march. Local enslaved people provided crucial intelligence about Confederate defensive positions, guided Union forces through the complex coastal terrain, and often actively assisted in military operations against their former masters. This collaboration between Union forces and the enslaved population represented one of the most significant aspects of the march's impact on Southern society, and illustrated the revolutionary potential of the Union war effort. The diplomatic and political implications of Sherman's approach to Savannah extended far beyond the immediate military situation to influence both domestic and international perceptions of the war's progress. The successful completion of the march would provide powerful evidence of Union military superiority that could influence the ongoing negotiations regarding Confederate peace overtures, while failure might encourage Confederate hopes for continued resistance and possible foreign intervention. Sherman understood that his campaign's conclusion would be closely scrutinized by observers throughout the world, who were assessing American military capabilities and political stability. The Christmas season setting for the campaign's climax provided Sherman with powerful symbolic opportunities that he exploited with characteristic flair for dramatic gesture. His famous telegram to President Lincoln, offering Savannah as a Christmas present, demonstrated both his understanding of the political value of symbolic victories and his confidence in his army's ability to complete the campaign successfully. This gesture transformed a military operation into a national celebration, while providing Lincoln with a dramatic demonstration of Union progress that could counter Democratic criticism of his war policies. The evacuation of General Hardee's Confederate forces from Savannah on December 20, 1864, represented both a tactical success for Confederate commanders and a strategic victory for Sherman's campaign. Hardee's skillful withdrawal across the Savannah River into South Carolina preserved his army for future operations, while denying Sherman the complete victory that might have resulted from the capture of significant Confederate forces. However, the evacuation also represented an admission of Confederate inability to defend their own territory, and provided Sherman with the bloodless victory he preferred for both military and political reasons. The liberation of Savannah's enslaved population that accompanied the city's fall to Union forces created scenes of celebration and chaos that illustrated both the revolutionary impact of Sherman's march and the challenges of managing the transition from slavery to freedom. Thousands of enslaved people celebrated their liberation, while simultaneously facing uncertainty about their future status and survival. The Union Army's arrival represented not only freedom, but also the collapse of the only social and economic system these people had ever known, creating both opportunities and dangers that would require careful management. The international reaction to Sherman's successful completion of his march to the sea reflected the campaign's significance as a demonstration of American military innovation and Union determination to achieve complete victory. European military experts, who had initially dismissed Sherman's strategy as recklessly dangerous, were forced to acknowledge its success and to reassess their understanding of modern warfare's possibilities. The march's success also strengthened Union diplomatic position by demonstrating that the Confederacy could not protect its own territory from Union assault. The humanitarian challenges created by Sherman's occupation of Savannah revealed the complex responsibilities that accompanied military victory and the difficulty of managing the transition from war to peace. The city's civilian population required food, medical care, and protection from violence, while thousands of formerly enslaved people needed assistance in adjusting to freedom. Sherman's administration of Savannah would test his ability to govern conquered territory while preparing for the next phase of his campaign against Confederate resistance. The economic impact of Savannah's capture extended far beyond the immediate military advantages, to include the restoration of one of the South's most important ports to Union control. The city's commercial facilities could now serve Union rather than Confederate interests, while its capture eliminated one of the last significant outlets for Confederate trade with Europe. This economic victory complemented the military and political achievements of the march, while demonstrating the comprehensive nature of Sherman's strategy for defeating Confederate resistance. As Sherman's army settled into winter quarters in Savannah, the successful completion of the march to the sea had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Civil War and demonstrated the Union's ability to strike at will throughout Confederate territory. The campaign had proven that the Confederacy could not protect its own heartland from Union forces, while the systematic destruction had eliminated resources that might have prolonged Confederate resistance. The march to the sea was complete, but Sherman was already planning the next phase of his campaign to bring the war to a swift and decisive conclusion. Chapter 5: The Revolution Complete. The occupation of Savannah in December 1864 marked not merely the successful conclusion of Sherman's march to the sea, but the completion of a revolutionary transformation in American warfare that would influence military doctrine for generations to come. The campaign had demonstrated that modern armies could operate independently of traditional supply lines while conducting systematic economic warfare against entire regions, fundamentally altering the relationship between military forces and civilian populations. Sherman's success in Georgia had proven that the Confederacy could not protect its own territory from Union forces, while the march's destructive impact had eliminated much of the economic infrastructure that sustained Confederate resistance. The immediate strategic consequences of the march's completion were visible throughout the Confederacy, as Confederate morale plummeted and desertion rates soared in response to reports of Union forces operating with impunity in the heart of Georgia. Soldiers throughout Confederate armies received letters from home describing the devastation wrought by Sherman's passage, leading many to abandon their units to protect their families and property. This collapse of Confederate morale represented perhaps the march's most significant military achievement, as it weakened Confederate armies throughout the South without requiring direct military confrontation. The political impact of Sherman's success reverberated through both Union and Confederate leadership, strengthening Lincoln's position, while undermining Confederate hopes for negotiated peace or foreign intervention. The march's dramatic conclusion provided powerful evidence of Union military superiority that Confederate peace negotiators could not ignore, while European governments finally abandoned any remaining hopes of Confederate independence. Jefferson Davis's government found itself increasingly isolated and without realistic options for continuing effective resistance against Union forces that had demonstrated their ability to strike anywhere in the Confederacy. The social revolution unleashed by Sherman's march had permanently altered the character of Southern society, destroying not only the physical infrastructure of slavery, but also the psychological foundations of white supremacy. The sight of Union armies operating with impunity throughout Georgia, while thousands of enslaved people gained their freedom, had shattered white assumptions about racial hierarchy and Confederate military invincibility. This psychological transformation was as important as the physical destruction in undermining the foundations of Confederate resistance and accelerating the collapse of the slave-based social order. The economic devastation wrought by the march would have lasting consequences that extended far beyond the war's end, as Georgia's agricultural and industrial capacity had been so thoroughly destroyed that recovery would require years of investment and reconstruction. The systematic destruction of railroad networks, manufacturing facilities, and agricultural infrastructure had eliminated not only current production, but also the capacity for rapid economic recovery. This economic warfare had achieved Sherman's objective of preventing the affected regions from contributing to Confederate war efforts, while also ensuring that the costs of rebellion would be felt for generations. The international implications of Sherman's march extended far beyond immediate military considerations to influence global perceptions of American military capabilities and democratic resilience. European military experts, who had initially dismissed American armies as amateur forces, were compelled to recognize the sophistication and effectiveness of Sherman's strategy, while diplomatic observers noted the Union's demonstrated ability to wage war on an unprecedented scale. The march's success strengthened American international prestige, while demonstrating that democratic governments could conduct modern warfare as effectively as traditional military powers. The humanitarian consequences of the march revealed both the destructive potential of modern warfare and the complex moral challenges created by conflicts that targeted entire societies rather than just opposing armies. While Sherman's forces had generally avoided direct violence against civilians, the systematic destruction of property and economic resources had created widespread suffering among innocent populations who had played no direct role in Confederate military operations. This suffering raised difficult questions about the moral limits of warfare that would continue to influence military ethics and international law. The transformation of Union military doctrine that resulted from Sherman's success represented a fundamental shift toward understanding war as a conflict between entire societies rather than just opposing armies. Traditional military theory had emphasized the destruction of enemy armies as the primary objective of warfare, but Sherman had demonstrated that targeting civilian morale and economic resources could be equally effective in achieving strategic objectives. This expanded conception of legitimate military targets would influence American military thinking throughout the 20th century and beyond. The lessons learned during Sherman's march would prove crucial during the final phase of the Civil War, as Union commanders applied similar strategies of economic warfare and psychological pressure throughout the remaining Confederate territory. The march had provided a template for defeating enemy resistance through systematic destruction of economic infrastructure, while avoiding costly direct confrontations with enemy armies. This approach would accelerate the war's conclusion, while minimizing Union casualties during the final campaigns. The personal transformation of Sherman himself during the march reflected the broader changes in American military culture that the campaign had catalyzed. The general who had begun the war as a conventional military commander had evolved into an architect of total war who understood the psychological and economic dimensions of modern conflict. Sherman's willingness to target civilian resources and infrastructure represented a fundamental departure from traditional military ethics that reflected his understanding of the war's revolutionary character and stakes. The environmental consequences of Sherman's march would persist for decades after the war's end, as the systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure and livestock had created ecological damage that would require generations to repair. The slaughter of farm animals, destruction of seed stocks, and elimination of farm buildings and equipment had disrupted agricultural systems that had developed over centuries. This environmental destruction was an intentional element of Sherman's strategy, designed to prevent the affected regions from quickly recovering their capacity to support Confederate military operations. The precedent established by Sherman's march would influence American military operations well into the 20th century, as subsequent commanders would cite the Georgia campaign as justification for targeting civilian infrastructure and economic resources during conflicts with both foreign and domestic enemies. The march's success had demonstrated that democratic governments could wage total war when necessary, while also raising difficult questions about the appropriate limits of military action in democratic societies. The cultural memory of Sherman's march would become one of the most enduring and controversial legacies of the Civil War, as Southerners preserved stories of Union destruction, while Northerners celebrated the campaign as a necessary step toward victory and emancipation. These competing narratives reflected fundamentally different understandings of the war's meaning and consequences, while also illustrating the lasting impact of Sherman's revolutionary approach to warfare on American historical consciousness. The completion of Sherman's march to the sea marked a turning point not only in the Civil War, but in the broader development of American military power and democratic governance. The campaign had demonstrated that the United States possessed both the military capability and political will to wage war on an unprecedented scale when fundamental principles were at stake. This demonstration of democratic resolve would influence American foreign policy and military doctrine for generations, while the march's revolutionary character would continue to inspire and disturb observers who grappled with the moral complexities of modern warfare. As Sherman prepared to continue his campaign northward through South Carolina, the march to the sea had already achieved its primary objectives of demonstrating Union power, demoralizing Confederate resistance, and destroying the economic infrastructure that sustained the rebellion. The revolution in warfare that Sherman had pioneered in Georgia was complete, and its lessons would shape the final phase of the Civil War, while establishing precedents that would influence American military operations for generations to come. The march to the sea had not only hastened the end of the Confederacy, but had also announced the emergence of the United States as a modern military power capable of projecting force anywhere in the world in defense of democratic principles and national interests.